Brad Durant ignored the rivulets of sweat dripping down his spine. The wetness pooled at the top of his ass, which wasn't exactly a pleasant feeling. The humidity combined with the temperature had left most of his body covered in a sheen of perspiration. He was used to pushing hard, being soaked and exhausted. This was actually a welcome relief from the last time he'd been in the rainforests of South America, cutting his way through the dense vines of the jungle on a hunt for the enemy, whoever his government had deemed the bad guys at the time. That always changed on a dime. Now, he was just hot. Well, hot and bored. Bored out of his mind, to be exact. He'd always excelled at sciences and had truly thought his life's calling might lie with the study of one, but there was no denying his nature. Underneath it all, he was an animal. He needed more to do than study plant samples or discover and classify new species of animals. While that cause was noble, it didn't check all his boxes. He craved action and excitement. His animal needed the hunt, more than what he'd been getting since he'd dived headfirst into higher education. At least the move had been paid for by the government. Seemed the least they could do since he'd devoted so much of his life to them already. Ironically enough, he'd walked away from a career that held all the danger and excitement he could ever need and more, thinking he wanted to settle down and start a family or something. A family? He nearly laughed at the idea of it all now. It wasn't as if something like him, a freak of fucking nature, should have kids. Not without the risk that others would find out what he was or that he'd passed it on to his children. He didn't even want to think on how he'd explain it to the mother if the kids suddenly turned into wolf pups. Funny enough, though, when he had dared to let his mind wander on the subject, he would often picture a dark-haired boy holding the hand of a red-headed little girl, the two clearly siblings and both his. But the idea was foolish. And then there was the whole thing about not even knowing if he could have children, if reproduction was even possible. It wasn't like he'd gotten a handbook when he was in his teens and underwent his first full shift from a human into a wolf. No one magically showed up to walk him through the steps and stages. There was no mentor, no big brother there to lend him a guiding hand. There had been fear, pain, more fear, and then shock and awe. Nothing else. If he did ever find himself lucky enough to discover a woman who loved him even with his defects, and if they managed to be blessed with little ones, he'd be there for the kids every step of the way. Sure, he'd hope they didn't get his abilities, but if they did, he'd help guide them. He'd walk them through a full shift. They'd never be alone like he'd been. They'd never be scared as he was once. The first time he went through a full shift, during the first full moon that occurred during puberty, he'd thought he was dying, that he was being ripped apart from the inside out. It had felt as if every bone in his body had snapped, and he'd believed his skin was going to tear clean off him during it all. The horror of it had made matters worse. Not that the ordeal needed any help. His shifts had gotten easier with age, but his first had been brutal. More so because of his fear and the fact that he tried to fight it with all he had. He hadn't understood what was going on. He'd been fine one minute, and the next, he'd fallen to his knees as his bones felt as if they were breaking one by one, his body contorting, his skin shifting. It had seemed like hours, but looking back, it had only taken minutes. And when he'd found himself stuck in the form of an animal, terror had gripped him. He hadn't known if it was permanent, and if he was a monster. If it hadn't been for Vic, Brad would have felt completely and utterly alone in the world, like a monster spawned forth from the great unknown, something that should have been hunted and put down. Thankfully, like had attracted like, and his best friend had undergone the same changes, the same pain, the same fear, the same worry that they were the only ones. Until recently, they still believed that to be true. They'd managed to go all through school, join the military, serve their country as Navy SEALs, and then work on getting degrees, all while thinking they were freaks, totally alone in the world, and all while doing unthinkable things to hide their secrets from others, from humans.